clicking on the video. In this trek, we discuss the topic hate, and we're joined by two special guests, Keyserling, the COO of Jigsaw, and Nnamdi Okike, co-founder of 645 Ventures. We discuss questions such as, is there anything you feel justified in hating, and how do we cure hate? And this has been one of our best treks so far, so I'm going to stop talking and let you enjoy the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. I'm Madison, and I'm a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma, joined by some of our community members and two special guests, which you will hear from in just a moment. So today we're talking about hate, and we start off with a word association. So when you see your name on the screen, give a brief introduction in the one to three words you associate with hate and why.
Okay, cool. Hey everyone, my name's Ashley. I'm 17 from Vancouver, Washington. When I think about hate, I think about like constricting. I think hate is, I don't know, I feel like it's an energy that closes you off to possibilities. Yeah, like it's like the opposite of like creation and like abundant energy. So yeah, constricting would be my word.
Hi, my name is Chabu Kapumba. I am 19 and based out of Toronto. And when I think of the word hate, my words are common but misunderstood. I think that people like there are a lot of opportunities where like hate is a part of the conversation or a part of the dynamic, but usually hate is just another variation of like hurt or disappointment or misunderstanding. So I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to the word hate, and those are my words, my word associations.
Hi guys, my name's Angel. I'm 18, from Maryland, like 15 minutes out from DC. And when I think of the word hate, the two words that echo in my mind are pain and intolerance. I think that all hate is bred out of a source of pain. And intolerance is pretty self-explanatory. People project hatred onto others because they lack, or not lack the ability, but they refuse, number one, to tolerate their existence, so intolerance, but also they refuse to empathize with what they're coming from and their unique experiences, which is a source of pain in and of itself. So yeah, pain and intolerance.
Hi everyone, my name is Raven. I'm 16 years old from Edmond, Oklahoma. When I first think about the word hate, probably the first thing that comes to mind is extreme. Me and my sisters always get on to me because I'll be going about my day-to-day life and like something will like mildly annoy me and I'll be like, oh, I hate that. And they'll be like, stop using that word. That is such an extreme word. That's not even like, you can use a better word for that. So definitely extreme.
Hey everybody, it's Nnamdi Okike. I'm in New York. I grew up in Massachusetts. 40 years old, so much older than you guys. In terms of the words I think about, so I think about types of hate. I think about racism, especially in this day and age, and how that's manifested itself in our society. I think about the idea of hate being kind of a result of being closed-minded. So kind of limiting and constricting in terms of your emotions. And the last thing I think about, the opposite of hate being love, I think those two feelings are extremely strong. They arise from passion, right? And they arise from strong feeling that, you know, they're opposites in a way, right? And in some cases you can hate and love in the same, something you love you might hate and vice versa. So
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Dan. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real treat to be here. And already, just in our first few minutes, this has been a really profound and stimulating conversation. I particularly like Angel's comment of pain as a association with hate. But for me, the word that I associate with hate more than anything is fear. For a lot of reasons. I think pain hate emerges from fear. I think they're interrelated. I think the two phenomenon sort of exacerbate each other. In my work for Google, when I see hate as a sort of animating force behind a movement, a group, a person, a phenomenon, you don't have to look far to see the underlying fear. And I think the most potent sort of expressions of hate around the world, which Nnamdi spoke very well on, we're about the same age, by the way, Nnamdi. Some solidarity I thought I'd offer you. When you see the expression of hate in the world, racism, sectarianism, violence, it is always accompanied by fear, deep fear. And I think that we'd be remiss not to consider fear when we think about how to diminish hate in the world. Because I think hate can be a sort of an overwhelming idea to approach, but all of us have approached the idea of fear. All of us have overcome it in one way or another. And I think that shared common experience might offer some common ground for us, for people who are experiencing hate one way or the other, in ways that we might share that experience with them and help them out of it.
Yeah, I mean, that was super profound. The word that I didn't, a lot of you picked words that I was gonna pick, so I'm gonna pick one that's kind of unintuitive. I think it's empowering is one that I would use, because why would it be so common if it didn't feel so empowering, even if it's an unhealthy, sort of unsustainable sort of power that you feel. I'm not gonna lie, I felt a deep sense of resentment to lots of people in my life, lots of people I'd never met before as well. And that fueled me for periods of time. And I think it can't be underestimated. Like, we have to understand why it's so common, right? If we want to combat it. Yeah.
Yep.
Hey everyone, I'm also sorry for being late. My piano lesson always runs over, never fails. But the word that came to mind for me was empathy, or I guess rather the lack thereof. That if you really feel strongly enough to hate somebody, then you can't possibly understand them and any of the complexities or nuances of that person or of that people group or of that idea. So that would just be, that's the phrase that comes to mind for me.
See, this is what is so good about Treks in general and the word association especially, is that I've already changed my words, already started to think about a lot of other things. So I would say that default is something that I would associate. As Raven touched on, it's just the word hate is so embedded in our language, and even like in politics as well. It's like parties are band together by the fact mostly that they hate the other party. And just like the word is so commonly used that it's become a default. So that's really interesting as well. But thank you all for doing that word association. Now we can go ahead and hop into the actual conversation. So if anyone has a question or provocation they want to pose to the group, go ahead and we can start talking about it.
Can I actually, Madison, you told us to just jump in here, so please forgive me if I'm being rude. I will endeavor to be concise and amusing, but I just wanted, is that okay, by the way, to just jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, because something that you said made me think back to what Gary said about empowering, a sort of strange choice of word association for hate, but I think there's deep truth there. Hatred is unifying. That's part of what makes it so powerful and so dangerous. And Madison, you touched on this point, which is it is often a default or a sort of it's something that people fall back on when they are fearful, when they are intolerant, when they feel constricted, when they feel misunderstood, in the absence of love, when they feel a lack of empowerment, or a lack of the ability to empathize. I just went through and I just read every single word association that you all provided. Part of the danger that I experience in my work with hatred is that it is a very strong unifying force. It can be to the point of Gary talking about how empowering hate can be. That's one of the worst things about it, is that it can bring people together under the sort of banner of the other, of hatred towards people. And I think there's something deep and innate about the power of hate to captivate our attention, to make sense of the world, to organize, how we look at what's going on in the world. So anyway, at the risk of violating the instructions towards brevity, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I actually want to build off of this with a provocation. Thank you for bringing that up. How about hate is more unifying than love?
I don't actually believe that. I think hate can unify over a short period of time, maybe even a medium period of time. But I think over the long term, love wins. And that may be idealistic, but I think it's hard for groups to hate. And I think it's hard for groups to hate over the long period of time and not splinter and not become extreme, not to mention not suffer in a lot of different ways in terms of punishment and penalties. And there's a great quote that I'll maybe put in the chat from Nelson Mandela about kind of love is being more powerful than hate over the long term. But I don't know. I don't necessarily believe that. I think it's hard to unify a group of people to hate for a long period of time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think this confuses like what is unifying and what is easy. Like hate is easy to do, and because it's so easy, like we think that it's just more unifying because it's easy to get people on board with that. There are two things that my parents never let me or my sister say. One is I hate blank, and the other is I don't care. And I think both get to the root of just the idea that like when you just say you hate something, like you're giving up on trying to understand it more. And if you refuse to understand someone, like that is in no way like long-term unification. That's kind of just a refusal to engage in anything more deeply.
I agree with both what Ashley and Nnamdi said. I think empirically we see that it's false as well. What we see as unifying under the banner of hatred, if you look a little deeper, it's actually extremely destructive, specifically to interpersonal, like close familial bonds. I'll bring up the example of QAnon. There's this little niche area on the internet, on Reddit, called QAnon casualties. I've brought it up before. But if you read through that subreddit, you see that the hatred that is supposedly unifying these groups of people who are experiencing immense mental distress, fear, and pain, when they preach hate and when they decide to congregate with these groups online, you can see the damage, like the very, very, very deep and profound damage that's being done to their relationships between them and their spouses, or them and their children, them and their families and friends, etc. And it's, I don't know, something that can't unify like the core of yourself, which is, I guess, your home, you know, the home is where the heart is. So your family, friends, etc. I don't see it as being one of, for the, like, sustainable in a sense. And just on a whole, I can't see it being more powerful than unifying under love. Yeah, I wouldn't even use the word unifying.
I think that all these points are like so incredibly true. And the way that I almost like to look at it is that hate is something that has like a promised limitation, like you will hit max capacity with it. It can only fuel you so far or empower you so far, as Gary mentioned, and it can only bring together a certain amount of people. It has set limitations in a way that love doesn't. That is actually boundless in terms of opportunities and the good things that it can bring. And so as much as it is able to achieve things, quote unquote, it does have a set limitation. And so it can be unifying to an extent, but you have to anticipate the downfall, so to speak.
On that note, I want to pose a question. What are the limitations of a hate-based political strategy?
I think there's a couple limitations. I think the first is it's hard to really command a majority of people, right? Like if you think about a love-based strategy, or at least an inclusion-based strategy, you can reach across a large number of folks and potentially have like a long-term coalition, versus a hate-based speech, but by definition is exclusionary to an extent. Now you could have a hate-based strategy based on excluding a minority, but oftentimes those things are temporal, like we've seen that in the United States, for example, like, you know, minorities are now becoming the majority, for example. So like there are certain approaches that are restrictive just in terms of like how big a coalition you can build. I think the other thing is it's hard to have long-term progress, right? So if you're continually basing something on hate, it's hard to really be productive, to really get anywhere. You know, there are extreme examples, like if you think about, you know, genocides and Holocausts, unfortunately, like those happen as a result of hate. And, you know, I mean, but oftentimes, you know, I mean, those inevitably break down. Unfortunately, they can have really negative results in short periods of time, right? So typically they're quite destructive over a short period of time. But I think those are some of the limitations.
Just to build on that, I totally agree with what Nnamdi's saying. And to put a finer point on political strategies that are constructive versus destructive, I think, you know, most people think of, if you regard politics as sort of the collision of interests, most people pursue those interests for some sort of gain or agenda, or, you know, a set of objectives. And if those objectives are destructive or deconstructive, that ultimately limits your ability to acquire more power, to provide, you know, to achieve your interests. So I think the limitations of a hate-based political strategy is that hate needs to be true for your political strategy to be viable. And it, in the service of what objectives is that political strategy? If the hate is the outcome per se, then ultimately it's a little solipsistic. You're not actually in the pursuit of any objective more broad than the sort of wielding of hate. You're sort of indulging in that hate in order to fulfill an interest that exhausts itself over time. And I mean, to all of Nnamdi's points about, you know, hate-based strategies lead to violence, period. Violence is not productive and constructive for society. It is the expression of the absence of politics, not the presence of it. So, I mean, I think the limitations of a hate-based political strategy is that arguably it's not a strategy at all.
I think Chabu raised a good point earlier about hate being limited. And I think, Dan, this marries well with your point that how do you keep fueling hate? Like when you hate a group enough, I mean, what actions do you take? There's a point where you have theoretically done all you can do to hate something. You know, if you commit, you know, mass acts of violence, what are you hating now, right? Like you kind of get to this like endpoint that's not really an endpoint, because you can't continue to fuel hate once you've resolved that hate. And so I think, like what Chabu said, it's not sustainable in any way. They hate-fueled movements, hate-fueled political strategies tend to fizzle out really quickly. And I would say another limitation is power. People shift, new generations shift. If you can't get enough people to hate something, it just totally dies out immediately. While I think like love-based political strategies, it can be a minority and it can still be incredibly successful in what they're trying to do. While if you're in the minority and hating, you know, a larger group, power restricts you in a way that it wouldn't restrict love.
I think that's really insightful, Zoe. And if I can just return and amend my previous comments, I think the limitations of a hate-based political strategy is that that strategy is ultimately about destruction. Hate is a very effective way to marshal the forces of destruction in society. It is not a very effective way to build things, to create more abundance. And ultimately, history is written by what we build, not what we destroy. And eventually you run out of things to destroy. So I think in that sense, the limitations of a hate-based political strategy are very pragmatic and tangible. They are whatever it is that is the object of that hate. You're limited ultimately by the exhaustion of that object. And then that hate needs to be transferred somewhere else or whatever, but you can already tell from just the logic of that sentence that you'll eventually run out of targets. And all throughout that process, you haven't built anything. And durable political power is ultimately about construction, not deconstruction.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also add on to that, that like the really simple thing is just it doesn't feel good to always be hating people or everything. It's like, yeah, it might feel good in like the short term to hate something, but like in the long term, if all your energy is spent on hating other people, there is no room for love, there is no room for creation, there is no room for abundance, and then your whole life is about someone else. And the thing you hate is literally like writing your own life story. And I don't think people want to live in that type of world long term. And so it just gets harder for people to buy into a movement based on hate over time.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way that the people running these political strategies or in these hate-based organizations are flourishing. I mean, like, there's no way that they can create things, as Dan brought up, like, it's the opposite of creation, just destruction.
Just play the role of contrarian here, but Gary inspired me. I realized you could just change the topic or pivot a little bit. I have noticed a phenomenon in this conversation, which is that we seem to be describing love and hate as opposites. And I wonder whether that's true. I wonder what the relationship is between love and hate and whether that's instructive for understanding both. I wonder whether it is true that hate-based movements don't experience love, that don't feel that for everything that they hate, there is something that is trying to be preserved, something that is trying to be conserved, something that's trying to be defended. Again, a fear of something else, of the other. It seems to me that the human impulse to regard something proximate as precious and important, and to feel either a sense of preservation or a sense of destruction towards that thing might not be opposite impulses. They might be related to each other, and they might just be different expressions of the human impulse to make sense of and order the things that we find around us in ways that we find safe and pleasing and that reinforce our own power and our own version of the world.
I just want to, like, Dan, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I was actually going to bring up this provocation as well. Actually, I have a quote from this book called I Commit in Jerusalem, so I'm just going to put it there. And to answer your question, I do not believe that love and hate stand at the opposite of the spectrum. I do believe that they're inextricably linked, and rather the opposite of both love and hate is indifference. I'm sure we've heard that quote like so very often. And you cannot operate, or I would say that hate is not sustainable, as unsustainable as it is. Hate isn't sustainable without indifference. They're in a society that is run based on doctrines of hate. There is a necessity to have a faction that keeps a blind eye to the pain and the suffering that is being perpetuated by such, a social order. And so back to your connection of love and hate, right? I agree. So, I mean, bringing it back to the Holocaust, the reason that there was such like an abundance of hate towards this one group was because there was a need, or there was a perceived need to protect this national identity that people loved, the quote unquote Aryan identity, the German identity, right? So I do think that in order to have hate, to have a burning, passionate hate, it is accompanied by something that we love and something that we do want to protect. And in order for such systems to continue to be in operation, there needs to be a certain section of the population that operates under like this air of indifference.
And to add on what Angel said, because I guess when you put love and hate on opposite sides of the spectrum, I think we're tempted to say that one's good and one's bad. And I think, Dan, what you just put in the chat makes the great point that love is not always good, but also that hate's not always bad. That hate in kind of short bursts can sometimes be a catalyst for people finding love. Like I think back to the civil rights movement, right? That Black people hated how they were being treated. That's the only way you can describe it. They didn't love the way they were being treated. Now they loved each other as a community. They loved this idea of having promise in the United States, but they hated the way they were being treated. And that was a catalyst for a movement that then, definitely shifted, right? Like there were definitely probably people in that movement who just hated everybody. But there were people that were like, no, this is an act of love to make our country a better place. It's an act of love to make this a better place for our children. But it more likely than not started out of hate. And I think that there's some things that can start out of hate, so to speak, that can then, turn into kind of a more productive love. But I think you can also be blinded by a sense of love as well. That can be incredibly dangerous, and perhaps even more dangerous than hate, because it can be so easy to trick yourself that it's a long term, like, oh, we love this leader, we love the way we do things in this country, and that can be incredibly destructive. But because you've framed it in a positive way, it seems like it's something you can continue to do.
This is a thought in the making. It's by no means cohesive, but for the question before this, I was kind of thinking about the fact that hate capitalizes on fear, and that's why it's so effective. But I think that there are also instances where love also capitalizes on fear, and it provides that like same sense of security or like conclusive resolution, which is why they both kind of can play out to the same really bad end goals, because it almost like it's harder to look at things from a more conducive approach or like lens, because both of them kind of capitalize on the same energy, which is really important because we don't want to misconstrue and almost overvalidate love, because it does have its faults as well.
Anyone have anything else to add to this question or want to pose another one?
Is there anything that you feel justified in hating?
Yes, but does it count if it's technically not tangible? If that makes sense? Like if I hate if I hate racism, does that count? I feel like, I don't know. I feel like that's just something people should do.
I feel like I like building off that, Angel. I feel like it's like I hate things that are rooted in hate. Like I hate the fact that other people hate people of color. Like if that makes sense.
It makes me wonder if hate's not the right word. You know what I mean? Like, are we applying hate to too many things? I mean, I don't want to be the person who's like, well, I don't hate racism, because I feel like that's the only word I can use to describe that. I hate racism. But is the way to counter other hate to hate it back?
To react to what Zoe just said, I think the difference between like not liking something with a strong negative connotation and hate is how unforgiving hate is. So it's almost like it's the line in the sand that says, beyond this point, there's no like reasoning that would allow for this to be appropriate. So I do think there are a few things that are genuinely justified for hating, using that specific definition. And for me, that's really any instance where like a community or individual is kept from flourishing for reasons that are not necessary. Because we definitely have all the resources and means to make sure that everyone has what they need. And we somehow managed to circumvent doing that after thousands of years. So I feel like that's something worth hating. There's just no real justification for that being the situation that we're in.
Yeah, and back to Zoe's point. Well, first of all, Chabu, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And just to pivot back to Zoe, a little tangentially related, but this is why the English language is, I don't know, I feel like it's constricting in a sense, because in other languages, there are like at least 5 different words. Let me not generalize, but there are multiple different words to describe a feeling that the English language encapsulates under one word. You know, not necessarily hate, but you know, what is it? Is it Latin has like 4 or 5 different words for what we consider love that all mean different things and all have different connotations. And so this isn't, I don't know what I'm trying to get at, but I wonder if there are other words out there that aren't in English that could encapsulate what we feel towards these very ancient and hateful and hateful and oppressive institutions and practices and phenomena.
Okay, I have a question I want to pose. So how do you cure hatred?
Why would you want to?
On what Dan just said, and I think, Angel, you raised a good point, that there are other words, right, that mean to strongly dislike something, but we don't go around saying, oh, I abhor that, I detest that. Like those aren't words that nearly have the same connotation or like kind of the zing to them as saying I hate that or I hate you. Like that means something so tangibly different to people who speak English than using any of hate's synonyms. So maybe that's something we need to change. And that could feed into how do we cure hatred, is help people start delineating, like what are you feeling? Don't just keep using this buzzword hate, because that's probably not what everybody means all the time. when they're talking about disliking something. And to almost sort of push back on what Chabu was saying, that there is no justification for, I guess, like how like we've limited people and their rights and their ability to flourish. I'm not saying that they're justified, but there's a reason for how they got there. That a lot of it is power dynamics, who's in the minority. People convince themselves we need to have an us and a them. There's this really phenomenal quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, and I definitely going to butcher it because I know it's prettier than this, but essentially you can't have a mountain without a valley. So you need to have something you can look down on, something you can say that's worse than where I am, in order to feel proud about where you are, which is fueled out of hate. There should be a way to love where you don't need something lesser than you to compare yourself to know that you're successful or that you're flourishing. So maybe it's simple as that, convincing people that you don't need to have a valley to feel like you're on a mountain. I'll leave it at that.
I really love what Zoe just said about like how we've slowly brought ourselves to the point where hate is the only word to use. And like seeing it as a trend, I feel is also really reflective of our society. The fact that like the simplicity, the lack of nuance, and like the straightforward nature of hate is like easier to process, easier to trend, and kind of fits more into like the way our society operates right now, in comparison to like different eras where there's a lot more investment in like word choice. I feel like that speaks volumes. But then also just like in reaction to this provocation, how do you cure hatred? Not by framing it as hatred. I would start off by saying, how can you better understand this other person or this other thing? Because the people or the things or the institutions that I love, I don't love because they're perfect and have done no wrong. I love because I have appreciation for their nuances and kind of their spectrum of ability. And so getting closer to understanding and that level of appreciation, the first step is really just seeing how you can better understand them.
Yeah, I think part of curing hatred too is, I mean, like it's hard to cure something if you don't give people an alternative. And I think part of curing hatred is also allowing people to see and experience like what love is, and well, maybe not even love, right? Just what is the positive manifestation of whatever you're feeling, and just giving people a positive vision for what could be. And I feel like when people see that, and when there is something better to move towards, it's a lot easier to leave behind, or at least to overcome feelings of like hatred and anger and like resentment, and judgment, because like I don't know, it just doesn't feel good to always be around those emotions. But if people don't have an alternative, it's hard to move away from that.
Yeah, I agree. I think I would add, another thing that I think historically has cured hatred is examples of individuals. Could be one charismatic individual or multiple groups who kind of demonstrate how ridiculous sometimes it is to hate. So I think about back in the 60s, the majority of Americans didn't really come around to supporting, changing the laws around racism until they actually saw people being beaten and people being hosed. And, it was visual imagery where people started to say, wait a minute, these people are nonviolent, they're being treated this way. It's a disconnect in my mind, right? And you oftentimes see examples of individuals who are willing to sacrifice themselves and put themselves in situations where you're like, I have to reconsider my core beliefs, right? And what's fascinating to me sometimes is that norms can really dramatically shift over time. Like I think about in my lifetime, for example, when I was a kid, for example, LGBTQ, like people didn't talk about that when I was young, right? Like when I was in high school, elementary school, it wasn't discussed. Now it's like completely different. Gay marriage is allowed, it's celebrated, but there are many countries that are the complete opposite, right? Like if you look at countries in Africa, like they still very much, if you're LGBTQ, you're ostracized, right? So sometimes it's a societal change that happens, and it may be one individual, it may be several, but there's a tipping, I would describe it as a tipping point, right? Something happens in the tipping point where people say, this is ridiculous, we have to change. It's just fascinating to see how that happens.
Kind of full circle, what Nnamdi's point made me think of was how you're not, and connecting to Angel's point about indifference earlier, you're not just turning people that used to hate into something else. You're converting people that were indifferent before, that thought indifference was okay. And I had never really, I guess I'm surprised that I didn't think about that a little bit more. And it feels like so much of what we focus on is like changing people that are really steeped in a particular dogma, when there's a lot of people that have long been not spoken to, that may have been indifferent for any number of reasons, maybe to no fault of their own, that could be serious allies in any sort of cause.
Gary, that's such an interesting point. I've been reading this book that kind of talks about the lead up to Nixon's presidency, and like this whole like there's this American that no one is speaking to and that nobody is caring about. And I mean those are the people that you have to convince. I would be of the opinion that most people aren't hateful, and I think Angel, you sent that quote about people in Germany. Most people didn't actually participate, in that genocide. Most people in Germany didn't. However, many of them were indifferent to that. They're enabling that, and so maybe the way to counter hate is not to convince the people who are being hateful, but convince the people who are enabling it. I think QAnon is another good example of that. Most people don't believe it. I kind of heard this interesting idea that there are these concentric rings of people who are really steeped in that ideology, people who are familiar, people who know someone who's familiar, and that those are the people you have to convince. Because if you have a really tiny group of people who hate something, but they can't spread that hate anywhere, then you've essentially have stopped any possibility of that hate being able to propagate to a larger group of people.
I'm struck by the ambition of this group, that the first impulse when we're talking about hate, or among the first impulses, is how do we cure it, and how do we make it better? I think that's really interesting. My obsession is what is it, and what is it about humans that lends them to be hateful creatures? And it seems to me that there's a lot of sort of core human behavior, unsophisticated primates that we are, that is pattern recognition, it's community forming, it's defining the self and the other, it's living through fear and opportunity. There are a lot of evolutionary impulses that I think inform why conspiracy theories are popular and always have been. We're talking about QAnon, but QAnon is just another expression of an age-old phenomenon of people believing a set of made-up things to make sense of the world. And there are lots of other more mainstream examples of that kind of mythology appeasing to the pattern-seeking mammals that we are. And hate is one way to organize that and define the world around you and help to instruct people of how to make sense of the patterns that they're seeing and societies. but there are lots of other ways too. And I think we will struggle to address hate as a part of our society, partly because I think that there is an innate impulse in humans to hate, for lack of a better word. But also because I think until we understand these sort of like innate impulses, the things that make us the organisms we are, it will be very hard for us to understand the sort of underlying conditions that allow us to be vulnerable to these kinds of manipulation, that encourage us to participate in this kind of group behavior. And so if we want to cure hate, I think we have to think really deeply about what it is in relation to the human experience. And the more that we sort of hate and describe it as something that is far away and not something contained within me and something that people do when they are fearful and constrained and lack empathy, I think that does a disservice to our ability to relate to that impulse that lives within all of us.
I think it's a really profound point you're making, Dan. I think it's a great point. And I think a lot of it stems from, psychological biases that we all have. I think the younger that you're exposed to certain actions, good or bad, the more implicitly you tend to generalize over time, right? So I think there's studies that show if you're somebody who's white and you grew up with a Black friend, you're more likely to be inclusive. Or if you're somebody who grew up with somebody from another group and you were exposed to that earlier, and vice versa, right? If you grew up in a family where you were taught to hate, or you had a certain pain or terrible experience as a result of somebody, human nature is to kind of generalize around that, right? Like we tend to live our lives in a sense of like the anecdotes, the personal experiences, those frame our beliefs over time. Although data and evidence and factual information, you might say would convince us otherwise, it's typically not the case, right? So when you think about hate, oftentimes I go back to like, what has this person been exposed to? Like, what have they experienced? And I think the older you get, I think the harder it is to reframe those things, right? I think that's why you find older folks, it's very hard to convince them of that certain biases are wrong, and why younger people, I think, are much more likely to say, wait, that's outdated. Like, that's old. I don't believe that. You know what I mean? Like, that's not true. So I agree 100%. Like, these biases, we may not even know we're doing it, but I think all of us may have grandparents, parents, older folks who are like, why do you believe that? Like, that's so outdated, right? But it came from personal experience, and over time, like that set of anecdotes, that set of personal experiences, and the more harmful they are, the more lasting they can be for individuals.
I'm trying to figure out I feel like there's this like recurring theme of empathy throughout this conversation. And just thinking about it, I'm finding it a little difficult to convince myself that hate is born out of the lack of empathy. In fact, I don't necessarily think that the two can be mutually, or have to necessarily be mutually exclusive. I know Dan keeps on bringing up like the phrasing, the other, and I'm like inclined to go all the way back to Hegel, and the master-slave dialectic, and how that dynamic of what I would consider hatred and oppression has empathy mixed within the interactions between who we deem, or who Hegel deems, the master and the slave. And in fact, it is that empathy, or what I would consider, this might not be empathy to you, but like the understanding of quote unquote the other, that actually breeds such an antagonistic relationship. So I'm just like, I'm not sure if the lack of empathy is exactly what causes hate. And I think when you understand something, it could be even easier to fear them and therefore hate them. So I don't know, maybe that's a provocation, whatever you want.
I will comment, Angel, that I see where you're coming from. I don't think a lack of empathy causes hate, but I think it can make it a lot easier. So I'm taking an African American history class, and it's just so interesting to me how we could convince people that people who look like people aren't real people. Like, we somehow convinced people that, oh, if a person has a darker skin tone, they're just not a human being. So you don't have to treat them like a human being. And suddenly, when you can remove yourself from that, when you can look at a person and convince yourself that's not another human being, then you don't have to treat them like one. And that lack of empathy, I think, helps so many other people then kind of fall into that fold. But to kind of loop back to something that Dan had mentioned earlier about, what leads humans to hate, kind of a revelation I think I had personally was that I think in a lot of ways, hate comes from a sense of scarcity. That if you don't think there's enough of something, if there's some pie and you're not getting the same slice of the pie that you were once getting, or you're worried about your slice getting smaller, that you find a reason to, like, you have to find something or someone to blame for that change. And I guess, and then to flip that though to, like, what's the opposite of hate, and that being indifference. That indifference comes from a sense of plenty. If you think everything is great, everything is fine, you think you have more than enough to be happy, that your children are going to be happy, then why change anything about the way that you're living?
Wow. So yeah. So I guess what I realized from what you just said, Zoe, is that I have for a long time oversimplified like two types of worldviews: an abundance sort of worldview and a scarcity worldview. And I'm realizing it's the earnest recognition of how much, well, it's the hopefulness, that it's the combination of hopefulness that things can get really better and that we're highly capable of making things better, and also the recognition that things are not great for a lot of people. Because if you are too much on the spectrum of like, things are great for the people that matter to me, and so I don't need to worry, then you're not going to act. And then also, if you believe that things are really bad for you, well, you might act in really bad ways or just give up. So I think what I hope that we are doing at CU is creating a culture where we know that the future can be very bright, much brighter if we consistently work at it together.
And sorry to jump right back in after I just spoke, Gary, but I actually wanted to push back on that. That I think we consider a lot of what we do at CU being done out of love. I think love can be out of scarcity too. I mean, I think if you think of some of the greatest leaders of love-filled movements, they have something personally at stake. Like, there's a reason that Black people led the civil rights movement. They had something at stake there. There was something that they weren't going to be able to promise to their children, or even in what we do at CU, that we have a feeling that our democracy is on a downward spiral. There's something at stake with that. We know that democracy is important. So love, now, I guess that a lot of our actions then are fueled out of love, but I think both love and hate can come from a sense of scarcity, that you don't have enough time, that there's so much at stake, and that there are two very different pathways by which you can go to, like, fulfill that dream that you have.
Yeah, I wanted to just go back to Angel's point, because I think it's a great point around, and it really makes me think, can hate and empathy work together? When I think about empathy, I think about walking in somebody's shoes, being able to understand their experiences, being able to empathize with them. I guess, what are examples where folks or individuals, even you guys, like in your lives, you've been able to be empathetic, but also to be hateful? Is that possible?
I think it's important to recognize that empathy also should have the duality of not assuming that you know or understand what someone's going through. I don't know if that makes sense, but like, if I'm like empathetic to someone's situation, I wouldn't assume or that I like understand it in full and know exactly what they're going through. And so you can be like empathetic about someone who and hateful at the same time, in the sense that I don't feel like this is coherent, but like I feel like you just don't want to assume that you understand them in full, and that's where hatred and empathy kind of have a distinction. So you can like understand them to a degree, but you assuming that you understand them enough could also lead to like more instances where you're almost like overstepping that boundary and you don't actually understand them. I'm not a coherent thought, but something along those lines.
And I also feel like you can't a lot of times logic your way out of emotions. Like I know there have been times when I've tried to be empathetic about certain things that I thought that I hated, and I'm like, okay, I can see like, I'm being empathetic about what this person is doing, or this certain group of people or organization, but it's hard to cure an emotion like that. And so it's more than just trying. And maybe it's like you have to actually be empathetic. You can't just like think through it, if that makes sense.
Like, I think it's not empathizing once, right? It's experiencing a consistent sense of empathy for the other. Like, I think it's one thing to slip into someone else's worldview and understand where they're coming from. It's another to, be able to kind of like go back to that perspective and integrate it into how you make decisions and how you act.
Ashley, I think you raise a good point. And I know this is, something like when you tell someone that like their behavior is racist, a common response to that is, I have a Black friend. I know someone who's Asian, right? So that's proof that that person feels some sense of empathy with that one person of color that they happen to know. But obviously that's not extended to every person of color or anybody of any one group. So yeah, I think you just raised a good point that they can kind of coexist and be selectively applied.
Cool. I think this is a good place to move on to reflection. So I'm going to go ahead and send the link to the notes in the chat so that you all can look over what we talked about. And when you have your reflection ready, go ahead and shout it out. And I can get us started. This just raised like so many questions. This reflection is not going to do what I learned justice, but I guess something that I'm thinking about going forward is something that really struck me is the language that we use. And I go back to that conversation in Gary's word association about hate being empowering. Like, if we're putting so many things under the umbrella term of hate, like, is hate really empowering, or is it like, is it something else? And also thinking about what Ashley was talking about, like, we can't cure hate if we don't give people an alternative. And I almost wonder if like indifference is an alternative that could be positive and that we could offer up. I know that like in politics today, like it's frowned upon if you don't have a certain opinion on like every single topic. But what does that mean, right? Like if our politics is pushing people into hatred based on their views, or like, then indifference in a way can be like really good, because then you're not like forcing yourself to like be against something. So I wonder if that's almost like in a way like an alternative that could be positive.
To reply to that, Madison, I think I would have to disagree. I genuinely think that indifference is probably more dangerous than hatred, in my opinion. In fact, I think that long-term conditions of indifference definitely breeds hatred. I mean, bringing it back to politics, if we're just in this constant state of indifference and we just don't care, right? The politicians in power who are somewhat at the behest of the general will, even though right now that's not really happening. If the general will is like, okay, well, do what you want, the politicians are obviously going to work in their self-interest even more than they're already doing right now. And that, going back to the scarcity point that we brought up, or that I think Zoe brought up earlier, having a political system based in indifference going along this thought experiment would breed ultimately conditions of scarcity, which would then lead to hatred, and then the cycle just it just continues. I really don't think indifference is the right mindset that we should have. And I don't even think it's a bridge away from hatred. I think that not the only alternative, because I don't want to be simplistic and lack nuance, but I think that, at least to me, the viable alternative is to encourage love that is rooted in the appreciation and continual sustainable empathy of the other, you know?
Anyone else have their reflections ready?
My reflection is definitely the fact that you would think that this would be a really negative conversation or like leave you feeling very heavy. But that's not how I feel in the slightest. I think that we've almost like explored and expanded the definition of hate in a way that almost like disempowers the negative power that it has to bring to conversations. So I think that that was really incredible, and I'm really happy that I got to participate in this track.
I guess I can hop in. Love everything that Angel and Chabu said too. But yeah, hate isn't always bad. Hate can sometimes be a good thing. Hate can be a catalyst for other more positive or love-filled movements. I think Dan posed a really good question in the chat of, do we support everything we don't actively resist? Do you resist everything you don't actively support? Is it always bad to be indifferent? And so I don't know what that nuanced word is that's in between, where you're not indifferent, but you can be empathetic to both sides. You can, work towards a solution on something that's in the middle between, maybe people who really love something or really hate something. Love, the word that Ashley just put in the chat. Maybe multi-partial is the right word. I'll have to look into it. But yeah, there are many places you can fall on the spectrum. It's okay not to be totally on the love side or the hate side of an idea, but that it's always bad to be totally indifferent.
Thank you, Zoe, for that. I have not organized my reflections in any meaningful way, but I'm going to talk anyway. So I think that Zoe touched on a really profound point, in which for me, this entire experience was less an exploration of hate and more an excavation of language and the words that we use to lend meaning to the world around us and human behavior. And I know Angel will appreciate this because she name-checked Hegel earlier, but I'm a big believer in sort of the Richard Rorty approach that like language lends meaning to everything in life. And you'd be well served by dwelling on the words that we use to make sense of the patterns around us, including hate, including love, including empathy. Because what I've taken away from this conversation is an insight that we really lack the language to explain not just what's going on around us, but even how we regard those things, even how we feel about those feelings. There's sort of a layered obscuring of all of these concepts because they're at once the most complex and the simplest things that we as humans experience, and we experience them all the time, every day. Sorry, of course, my phone rings in the middle of that very profound thing I'm saying. Sorry. The practicalities of Zoom. Anyway, my reflection on this is the majesty and the confusion of language. And we could spend a whole nother hour talking about how to make sense of what we're all seeing all over the world. And like, I'm regretful that we don't have that hour, because the coolest thing about this was how you all took that concept of hate and used it as sort of a tool to dig out all of the sort of emotional entrenchment and situation we find us in. It's a way to express how we make sense of the world around us. And I love that we're expressing it as much with love as we are with hate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree, Dan. I think that was really well said. And I first wanted to say I really enjoyed this conversation. I just found it inspiring to hear everybody's viewpoints and really to kind of be able to be inspired by your thinking. I had a couple of takeaways. I think the big one is that there's so much nuance to the concept of hate. I came into this conversation believing hate was kind of cut and dry, but the more we talked about it, I started to understand, one, there need to be a lot more words to describe it. It's very nuanced, it's temporal, it can be a catalyst for positive action if used correctly. I almost think, it leads me to think that there should be more of a study around hate speech and some of the nuances around hate speech, and especially given in this day and age with the proliferation of social media, it's just going to be a bigger and bigger issue around how hate speech is characterized and censored. You think about what's happening with Twitter and Facebook and social media right now in terms of folks being blocked. It just seems to me like a much deeper understanding of like, how do you define hate speech? What is it? Like, what are some of the categories of it? How do you prevent it? What should be and should not be prevented? I just feel like it's a very interesting area of study that I think, all of us can probably, play a part in addressing, because I think it's just going to become more of an issue in the decades to come.
I'm not really sure what my reflection is. I'm still trying to process everything. I think this trek has definitely given me a greater appreciation for the nuances between hate and love. Honestly, when Madison first put this in Slack that a trek on hate was a thing, I didn't sign up, and I was about to respond sign me up for the one on love, because I just wasn't sure what to expect from a whole conversation around hate. Yeah, I'm not sure what I think, but I do feel hate is a barrier to love, and even though it can be a a force, well, a catalyzing force, I think at some point we need kinder and more abundant visions for the future that, I don't know, that allow us to actually flourish. Because I think it's just enough to keep you going, but it's not really enough to help anyone reach their full potential.
Well said, Ashley. And what this whole conversation made me think about was how much I hate unrealized potential and how that drives me. It gives me so much fuel. But at the same time, to Dan's point, I could just, using the power of language, I could just be like, I love seeing people and systems realize their potential. Right? I don't even know. It's an open question to me. What's the difference? It's almost like the practical effect of the words, that the way that we we ourselves interpret the words is the difference, right? So like, let's say I had a really healthy relationship with the word hate for some reason. Maybe I could say, oh, my mission, like I'm driven by hate of unrealized potential. Maybe like in practice, that allows me to be a really effective empowerer of other people. So yeah, I mean, I didn't expect to see hate and love in that sort of relationship until this call. So I want to thank everyone for that.
My sisters, if my family was here, they'd be making fun of me of this is probably the longest time I've ever not spoken. But actually, right before this call, me and my sister were watching one of those like Jubilee Middle Ground episodes. And it was actually talking, like right where we ended was talking about the difference between like indifference and like hate and love. And my sister were making these points about indifference, and I was just so quick to like, I was just not listening to her. And then I came on this call, and then when we kept talking about hate, that I kind of applied like how I was doing to how people filled with hate sometimes do, is that they're so, not all hate-filled people, but they're so quick to just not listen, and that they're always want to jump to kind of spread that hate. And I kind of, when I came on this call, I was like, maybe she has a point, because I all throughout this call I was like, maybe my sister was right on that, because I feel like, and then I wanted to apply this to hate, because so often they just immediately jump. And I think, and it's not even that sometimes hate causes you to jump. Love can't, just any strong emotion, you're always just jump to speak. And I think when you finally just sit back and you're just like, don't say anything, you realize so much, like, because like I didn't even have coherent thoughts to speak during this conversation, because I was constantly thinking about what everybody else was saying. And I think that's probably my biggest takeaway from this, because I was just like, wow, once you actually just shut up, you kind of realize that you're not the only one who needs to speak, or that like your emotions aren't the only strong emotions possible.
Wow, that's so powerful.
And I think that's an instance of like, I don't know if you would call it indifference. Maybe there's a different word for what you just explained, but again, it's not just love and hate that have like so many different things being described into that one word as well. But also wanted to know, Dan and Nnamdi, what your thoughts were on the trek overall.
Oh man, I thought it was awesome. You know, as I mentioned, one of the most inspiring conversations I've been a part of for a long time. And it just, it's wonderful. You know, I really just am amazed by the thoughtfulness that you guys, just the thoughtfulness you have. I mean, I was definitely not this thoughtful at your age. So, it's great. This is really cool. And, hope to be part of another one in the future.
I mean, yeah, this is wild. Like, I'm still not as thoughtful as you all are. I mean, this is, what a treat. I'm so glad I had this at the end of my day, because it's such a stimulating, an inspiring opportunity to talk with you all. What did I think of this? They should be 2 hours. We can't even get started after an hour, Gary. So there's some feedback for you.
Well, we have these like all the time, so you all are more than welcome to come to a future trek. Would love to have you back. And thank you all so much for taking the time out of your night. Really good. I think this has been one of our best treks so far. So thank you all for making that happen. And I will see you all later. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Madison, thank you all.
Thank you all.